Hi, good evening. Thank you for coming out for this event. And I have a brief intro to read, and then Sophie will read her lecture, and we'll then in the end do Q&A. So when I first read of the capitalist techno-utopia of biobags, artificial wombs that enable fetal gestation, I read it not as a human utopia, but one for other mammals. Or better said, a human species' desire for extinct fellow mammals. Turns out, in our Jurassic Park fantasies of reverting extinction, solving animal surrogacy seems to be crucial. The problem is not, to this day, that technology for reproducing the woolly mammoth's DNA with near-extinct elephant species serving as wombs to do the life-risking womb work for us is required absent the technology of a biobag. In short, in these scenarios, the problem is not Dolly, but who would mother, nature, and nurture the said woolly mammoth Dolly lab specimen. Repronormativity, as Sophie Lewis uses the term, is active here too, under our Western conservationist lab coats and guilt-ridden fever dreams. It is hard to track. If it is hard to track, it is only because it is tackling it at the expansive level of species reproduction in the face of a climate crisis. So, full disclosure, the talk today and Full Surrogacy Now, the book around which it revolves and expands, will pertain mostly to human reproduction and surrogacy. This kind of out of left field introduction is just meant to signal how the active work of entangling the nuclear family, pregnancy, and sex has a wide-ranging effects beyond how these articulate the biological, sexual, and reproductive in a single act of heteronormative patriarchal childbirth. There are many angles and terms and slogans with which Lewis approaches and attacks these naturalized forms of reproduction. Full surrogacy now is one of them, but also abolish the family, amniotechnics, and seclusion are others. What is notable is how these articulations of the biological, the sexual, and reproductive come undone under Lewis's analysis seemingly all at once in this process. The effects are felt in toppling anti-sex work feminism, TERFs advocating for child liberation, while never losing sight of critiquing capitalist surrogacy and how it is currently practiced, or losing perspective on how the white construct of the nuclear family has historically outsourced reproductive labor to people of color. This active work on all fronts is necessary for other nature cultures, one word, as to use Haraway's terms, come into being. Till then, all biobags can promise is to hold water in their petro-capitalist plastic containers waiting for a grassroots wetware expropriation for the queer gestational commune Lewis talks about. Sophie Lewis is a writer and part-time faculty member at the Philadelphia branch of the Brooklyn Institute of Social Research. Sophie's interdisciplinary work tends to blend feminist theory and cultural criticism, interrogating work, nature, and reproduction in a queer utopian mode. Her essays have appeared in many journals, both academic and non-academic, including Science, Feminist Review, Gender, Place, and Culture, Viewpoint, Boston Review, the London Review of Books, the New York Times, Mute, Salvage Quarterly, Logic, The New Inquiry, and Commune. She is also a member of the ecologic writing collective Out of the Woods and an editor of the journal Blindfield. As an occasional translator to make ends meet, she has translated books from the German, including the popular Communism for Kids by Bini Adamczak, if I'm not mispronouncing, A Brief History of Feminism, Antje Schrupp, and Other in Rule by Paula Villa and Sabine Hark. Forthcoming with Verso. Her PhD from the University of Manchester was in geography. No, sorry. Well, the bio is on the website, and you're welcome to read it further.
Thanks for coming. Thanks, Mariana, so much. Thanks, Will, and everyone else at e-flux. Okay, 2019. In addition to its more general geopolitical ghoulishness, has been a difficult one for this particular family abolitionist. It's been surreal. My personal bio-familial circumstances this year have involved terrible and looming bereavement compounded by precarity, not to mention border and immigration-related obstruction and capture. I call this surreal not because it was somehow hypocritical to be speaking publicly about abolishing the family and its scaled-up counterpart, the nation, while simultaneously struggling, like so many people right now, to cross borders in order to be with a relative. Nor is it somehow, contradictory to be preaching full surrogacy while changing my historically estranged mother's incontinence pads. Quite the contrary, it's been surreal because the temporal coincidence of the Full Surrogacy Now launch with this unprecedented requirement for me that I be at my closest bio-relative's bedside brought the stakes of my subject matter to life with almost unbearable intensity. A forum in the journal Society and Space recently referred to a panel on the book, not as author meets critics, as is usually the case, but as a doula formation. And doula formations are always what make shit like this bearable, aren't they? Making obvious in the process the never-ending chain one must draw in order to answer the question, who doulas the death doulas? And as though to ram this home, in the midst of it all, I got to have my own uninsured health emergency, a surgery paid for on GoFundMe by many comrades. Yes, the phrase full surrogacy, as I've been trying to evoke, is a description both of the dystopian structure of planetary reality in the present, so class, subalternity, crowdfunding, outsourcing, indentured labor, invisibilized subcontracting, and above all, reproductive stratification, in the phrase of Shelley Colin, and a utopian cry at the same time for the self-actualization of the fundamental sort of communistical mixed up in each otherness that characterizes our bodies and their labors, the porous promiscuity and generosity that capitalism steals and turns into all manner of accumulation schemes, rentierships, neo-feudalisms, and private institutions like the family. My mother, and she is my mother even if I am mothered now by many, tragically has basically practically no one else. And when I learned that Shulamith Firestone's week-old corpse had been found in her apartment, devoid of groceries, utterly alone, a billion miles away from the communal, transgenerational households based on polymorphous sexual freedom and non-Oedipal care structures which she had envisioned in her post-capitalist future, it was difficult not to shudder and draw a parallel between this particular 68er who streaked across the sky like a comet before being claimed by depression, and the one in my life. Vicky Margry, the author of a great Pluto book about Firestone, has suggested that Airless Spaces, Firestone's series of vignettes about despair and mental illness, can be read as a coda to the dialectic of sex, quote, a nightmare inversion of the more humane society glimpsed there. Quote, read together, the two books declare that we don't own each other, that we are equals, that we are all vulnerable and in need of care, unquote. So while my adventures in mother-daughter rapprochement via the reverse parenting of cancer care across international borders I can neither afford, nor am in fact legally allowed to cross, have been hard, nothing could have better illustrated the impossibility, the unjustness, and the structural scarcity for all concerned, baked into the heart of the private nuclear household, this naturalized template for social reproduction I set out in my book to criticize, just like Firestone set out to in hers 50 years ago. My manifesto is undeniably critically Firestonian, but in the course of changing the world, Firestone also put a lot of racism and contempt for the feminine and genuine distaste at the body in her manifesto. So, while I make no claim to having the same kind of impact, I've tried to help negate those tendencies in queer techno-gestational feminism entirely. They do not belong there, being as the proper lineages of anti-work, womb worker-led communism is, for example, black women for wages for housework, and the queer polymaternalist philosophy of kinlessness developed by Hortense Spillers and Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Inspired by the latter, I've been slowly teaching myself over the last 8 months how not to divorce what I was lecturing about from what I was feeling. And people all over the world have honored me in turn, sharing their personal responses to what I said and wrote in a register of disclosure and vulnerability that sometimes really surprised me. Admittedly, sometimes audiences' emotional responses to my propositions also took the form of ridicule and an interesting kind of anger. People get furious, one friend mused to me when I was in England. People get furious when you tell them that they deserve more than they have, when you tell them that they deserve more than they received when they were children. I think the emotional formation there is something along the lines of, it might be a kind of abusive scarcity machine, but it's my abusive scarcity machine. And people did get furious, and this fury was not limited to InfoWars and the pro-life alt-right, although that kind of attention was abundant. However, more often than not, touring Full Surrogacy Now has seemed to raise up an oasis of odd kinning and comradeliness from the desert. I'm trying here, as you can see, to keep faith with the willingness that people have shown me to keep the personal, the traumatized, the care-needy, and the emotional self in the room for this conversation. Of course, it's just my luck that I've tried to do this the one time that I'm actually in the New York art world and feeling incredibly kind of conscious of that. But it's the right thing to do. It's none too common, in academia at least. But perhaps I've left academia, fingers crossed. I'm going to read a few paragraphs from the beginning of Full Surrogacy Now in a moment. Be warned, as Sarah Sharma said in Toronto a few weeks ago, I begin this book with the molecular. This has been on my mind recently on account of reading groups I'm hoping to join on Debalina Roy's molecular feminism. Why did you begin with the molecular? Sarah asked. In front of a bunch of people. And at the time, I think I didn't really know, but the simplest answer is that, like Roy, I feel it is needful that we repoliticize biology and go deeper into Harawavianism, crucially, that we do so in a communist mode. What Alyssa Battistoni calls maybe an eco-xenofeminist mode, determined to remake nature wherever we find nature to be unjust. And the other reason it makes sense to begin with all the lurid, productive traffic mediated by the human placenta, which I'm about to describe. Because, as some people say, isn't that just pregnancy? Is that the only thing that distinguishes surrogate and non-surrogate pregnancy is the possibility of a wage. My book is about making the term surrogacy non-thinkable, just like the concept of a human being being your property should be unthinkable. And it goes about trying to advance that utopian horizon in which children do not belong to progenitors as property, in part by rejecting biocapitalist definitions of and dichotomies between assisted and so-called natural reproduction, and by simply and insistently pointing out that the technology in an awful lot of industries is still overwhelmingly simply people. In the case of assisted reproductive technologies, the technology is gestational labor. Commercial gestational surrogates working in dormitories in Kenya, Mexico, South Africa, Laos, and Ukraine are the productive technologies, as well as the mediating ones in the new sectors of anthrogenesis that we are used to calling assisted. as though there had ever been a mode of manufacturing humans that was unassisted. Okay. It is a wonder we let fetuses inside us. I can practically do this by heart at this point. Unlike almost all other animals, hundreds of thousands of humans die because of their pregnancies every year, making a mockery of UN Millennium Goals to stop the carnage. In the United States, almost 1,000 people die while doing childbirth each year, and another 65,000 nearly die. This situation is social, not simply natural. Things are like this for political and economic reasons. We made them this way. Pregnancy undoubtedly has its pleasures. Natality is unique. And that is why, even as others suffer deeply from their coerced participation in pregnancy, many people excluded from the experience for whatever reason, be they cis, trans, or non-binary, feel deeply bereft. But even so, and even in full recognition of the sense of the sublime that people experience in gestating, it is remarkable that there isn't more consistent support for research into alleviating the problem of pregnancy. And what particularly fascinates me about the subject is pregnancy's morbidity, the little discussed ways that, biophysically speaking, gestating is an unconscionably destructive business. The basic mechanics of it, according to evolutionary biologist Suzanne Sadadin, have evolved in our species in a manner that can only be described as a ghastly fluke. Scientists have discovered, by experimentally putting placental cells in mouse carcasses, that the active cells of pregnancy rampage unless aggressively contained through every tissue they touch. Kathy Acker was not citing these studies when she remarked that having cancer was like having a baby, but she was unconsciously channeling their exact findings. The genes that are active in embryonic development are also implicated in cancer. And that is not the only reason why pregnancy among Homo sapiens perpetrates a kind of biological bloodbath, which is perfect because the word amnion literally kind of means a bowl of blood, in the sense that etymologically it referred to the vessel for the blood of slaughtered animals, particularly lambs, in sacrificial contexts, literally a bath of blood. It's the specific, functionally rare type of placenta we have to work with, the hemachorial placenta, which determines that the entity Chikako Takashita calls the mother fetus, all one word, tears itself apart inside. Rather than simply interfacing with the gestator's biology through a limited filter or contenting itself with freely proffered secretions, this placenta digests its way into its host's arteries, securing full access to most tissues. So mammals who don't have this kind of placenta, placentas that don't breach the walls of the womb in this way, they can simply abort or reabsorb unwanted fetuses at pretty much any stage of a pregnancy. And for them, life goes on almost as normal. Conversely, a human cannot rip away a placenta in the event of a change of heart, a sudden drought, say, or an outbreak of war without risking lethal hemorrhage. To be sure, it has been relatively straightforward in many parts of the world to stop gestating at the very beginning of the process, simply because an unremarkable or even unnoticed miscarriage occurred, or because the gestator had access through a knowledgeable friend to abortifacients. But as pregnancy progresses, our embryo hugely enlarges and paralyzes the wider arterial system, supplying it, while at the same time elevating hormonally the blood pressure and the sugar supply. So the last thing to die when a gestator dies will often be the pregnancy. No wonder philosophers have asked whether gestators in our species are persons. It seems impossible that a society would let such grisly things happen on a regular basis to entities endowed with legal standing. The fact that so many of us endowed with viable wombs are walking around in a state of physical implantability. No pill, no IUD, ought by rights to be regarded as the most extraordinary thing, right? Given this biology of hemachorial placentation. This is not to suggest for a moment that it's simply a matter of individual choice. Even as urban working class and black parenting continues to come under attack, for instance, in the US, here, where we live, the barriers to black and working class gestators' access to contraception and abortion grow steadily more formidable. And such contradictions seem to be part and parcel of capitalist geopolitical economy, which needs populations to tap at will and extinguish in the process of making others thrive. Obstetric care in India remains to this day among the most scant in the world, even though India exports and offers obstetric medical care, plus, as my book details, outsourced gestational services, until the Indian Supreme Court rudely outlawed surrogacy, just as my book was going to press, to customers all around the world, often enrolling in this assistive surrogate labor, the very same populations that were targeted for sterilization just a couple of decades ago. Okay, I'll stop there. Now, around the world, also Jenny Brown contends, there's currently a gestational strike going on. And opting not to make fresh people is one of many correct responses to unsafe, unaffordable, and unsatisfactory working conditions for gestating and parenting, not to mention circumstances of planetary death. Let us make nothing with our uteruses, says this anti-productivity insurgency, and we will have produced something good. Let us instead gestate the living in a more distributed, liberatory, less laborious way. It's a false dichotomy, obviously. Firestone polemically suggests in the Dialectic of Sex that the best way to raise children is to lay off all capitals. And while I'm sympathetic to her aims there, I would counter from my experience of people trying to do non-dyadic parenting, not to mention my mum's carousel of daily minimum wage carers, that it will take the coming of the commune, surely, for people to be able to do something as labor-intensive as lay off. A couple of years on from my incredibly generative disagreement with Donna Haraway about populationism, where I wrote a love letter to the Cyborg Manifesto and criticized her book on making kin in the Zulu scene, and then somehow got to have breakfast with her, my teen idol, and have it out with her. I still can't quite bring myself to say, make kin, not babies. She is the one who taught and ongoingly teaches me that gestational politics is about quality, not quantity. To revive an ancient word that means kinship bonds arising from blood, not from blood, arising not from blood, but from affinity. I think I rather want to say make kith, K-I-T-H, and maybe babies. I'm still agnostic on that last bit. What I feel surer about is that staying with the trouble is good, but making a fiercer kind of trouble is better. Though I recognize that the distinction isn't total. For instance, when it comes to the nitty-gritty of gestating, as I say, maybe staying with the trouble and amplifying trouble are to all intents and purposes the same thing, at least right now, on account of our collective sort of kink-shamey discomfort with the fact that gestationality is one of those things that is brutal as well as loving. This apparently surprises some of my readers, but I would actually dispute that I practice relentless and unblinking negativity about pregnancy. That's a quote from a sympathetic critic in this book. I hope my stance is much more dialectical. It's true that there is a strategy of negation at work. For instance, when, as Tucker Carlson jubilantly observed, I agree with the proponents of forced gestation, that to abort a fetus involves killing, whilst rejecting their premise that that means, ethically and politically speaking, case closed. My purpose here is, unmistakably, I hope, not to dehumanize fetuses or those who kill them, but to strengthen the abortion struggle by pushing the envelope at a time when the aforementioned struggle is losing ground at a vertiginous pace and yet seems bent on remaining dismayingly disorganized, equivocal, and apologetic. And if you'd like me to rant about Margaret Atwood and her view that everybody hates abortion, nobody likes abortion, we can do that in the Q&A. Agreeing with the forced lifers that were abortion killing, it would obviously be wrong and bad, and deploying the gambit that luckily it isn't, instead it's choice or healthcare or what have you, does not seem to be a winning strategy for the simple reason that it isn't entirely honest and doesn't allow us to want what we want, namely free, no questions asked abortions on every street. And the truth is that abortions are choice and healthcare and killing. Why cede even an element of the truth to our enemies? Why allow our starting point to be so afraid? But back to the negativity about pregnancy point. The purpose in opening with this molecular violence, as I see it, is very much not to be negative about pregnancy, but precisely to insist on the admiration I have for those who participate in this most extreme of extreme sports. The point for me is that everyone should be empowered to have as free and pleasurable, whatever that means to you, experience as possible of being put to work by a placenta. To date, gestating a fetus seems to have meant everything to people from a maddeningly uncomfortable bore to a sublimely, ecstatically self-annihilating activity. And surely it's also obvious that it's an activity to which I'm personally a little bit attracted. But the fact is, too, that right now, gestating claims hundreds of thousands of gestators' lives a year and injures untold others. So it makes me feel a bit crazy that a labor with these kinds of statistics isn't, at least questioned. But to reiterate, if I write about this riskiness and grisliness of maternal-fetal interaction on page 1, it's fundamentally because I think it's imperative that a process many of us want and like to do be rendered as safe and non-lethal as possible, at least for those of us who want it to be safe and non-lethal. Again, I also feel that people should be free to consensually get up to weird, unhealthy, dangerous things. If I come across as edgy or provocative here, and in that sense, caricaturally Firestonian, perhaps it's because of my frustration with the silence on the subject of this molecular aggressiveness, which I do feel shrouds the topic of natality, as though admitting to pregnancy's ripping, agonistic character would necessarily be to dismiss it. To be clear, Firestone was disparaging it, and I see this disparagement as one of the constitutively heterosexual things about her consciousness. As such, while some of the criticisms of the dialectic are wholly misplaced, such as the charge that it is technologically determinist, I want us to be clear on this. Her argument does flow from disgust and fear at pregnancy and mothering, which is to say, matrophobia, somatophobia, femphobia. And even if we apologize for this as a moment in the unfolding of the very dialectic that she is, after all, theorizing, as my critic, Maria, would say, it is straightforwardly negative. When it comes to the critical Firestonianism that I'm making a case for a revival for in the present, it will be different. It will be different, frankly, or it will be bullshit. Nothing but uncompromising love and respect for gestators and wannabe gestators of all genders, love and respect for their hardcore xenophilic desires to gestate and co-gestate and gestate for a little while and then not gestate, must undergird the abolition of capitalist gestation. This is not as Firestone knew, what undergirds research into ectogenesis, i.e. prosthetic, automatic, machine pregnancy in the real world, in the present. Indeed, the scientists involved in perfecting ectogenetic techniques today, as I found out in my adoptive hometown of Philadelphia recently, do not appear to be motivated or funded by a desire to liberate gestators from the constraint and coercion they currently face in the domain of gestational work. But I am an anti-work kind of commie, which you probably noticed. And for me, it means, what that means is communizing and then abolishing, and only then, perhaps, automating work. The ectogenetic brooders that Firestone envisioned for making babies, unless you wanted to do it yourself, sound great to me in Matapoiset, the post-capitalist world described by Marge Piercy in Women on the Edge of Time, to give some flesh to that blueprint. But skipping to automation in the capitalist present is a recipe, as Firestone relentlessly insisted, for a nightmare. Perhaps in an overreaction to this knowledge, I probably ought to confess at this point that I harbor an unfortunate tendency to declare with unearned confidence that there is not going to be a techno-fix for the violence of gestation. I feel sort of intuitively that when it comes to some types of work, notably care work, the success of a struggle against the evil that is work will not look like a vanishing act. In other words, the victory of anti-work in the sphere of gestating will not be fully automated. At most, it will be partially automated, if we're lucky. The abolition of work, perhaps always, but certainly in this context, will not eradicate the labor entirely. My utopia in this domain is an outpouring of gestator-led research dedicated to minimizing gestational work's harms, a minimization of its alienatedness, achieved through sharing and redistribution, towards a maximization of its pleasures. By the way, the turn to so-called natural childbirth, which earned such fiery contempt from Firestone for being bourgeois, more accurately stands for a regimen full of carefully stylized gestational labor hacks and artifices, a suite of mental and physical conditioning that can be billed as intuitive, but which nevertheless takes time and skill to master. Natural childbirth has never gone entirely out of fashion and is still extremely popular among diverse social classes, and while particular sub-doctrines of natural childbirth continue to come under well-justified fire wherever they stray into sort of moral mystification, the broader free birthing movement's foundational critique of just-in-time capitalist obstetrics and its colonial patriarchal history, whereby midwives, witches, and their indigenous knowledges were expelled from the gestational workplace, is hard to fault. I have no quarrel with full-spectrum doulas. By the same token, denaturalizing gestation, insisting on its being work, is its exceptionality, its cyborgicity, and its care-worthiness. All of that has sometimes involved strategies of naturalization, splicing in a labor struggle against the grain of a nature whose fundamental indifference to maternal death, injury, and suffering does not, paradoxically, come naturally to most of us. Thus, another reason why I speculate that pregnancy will never be techno-fixed is because, as Irina Aristarkova suggests in her book, Hospitality of the Matrix, the machine cannot nurse. But again, I do want to insist relentlessly that the full surrogacy of the capitalist class is very much here already, that the problem of pregnancy has, in other words, already been techno-fixed for those whose lives really matter. Firstly, because under capitalism and imperialism, safer, or at least medically supported gestation has been the privilege of the upper classes. But secondly, because the high-end care historically afforded to the rich when they gestate their own young has lately been supplemented by, and here's where I finally actually mention surrogacy in the book, a technology that absorbs 100% of the damage from the consumer's point of view, the human labor of a gestational carrier. Commercial gestational surrogacy amounts to a new and unprecedentedly literal way in which people can continue, as they have long done, to make babies for others in exchange for the money required to underwrite morally as well as materially their own otherwise barely justifiable baby having. I want to draw your attention now to something one Thomas Schaffer, a renowned pediatrician and pioneer of neonatal liquid breathing, said to me back in February. As we have known for some time, oh God, let me not try the accent, this is going to get me in trouble. Fetuses are not little adults. I want to draw your attention both to this and to a claim that was made in Philly in February of this year by other scientists who have recently succeeded in building a kind of Ziploc bag that artificially gestates fetal sheep. Our system is essentially a recreation of the environment a fetus naturally resides in. The lamb is getting everything it would be getting inside mom. Everything it would be getting inside mom. Now, I had sought Dr. Schaffer out because last winter I had started to hear rumors about these miraculous clinical developments taking place down the road, involving artificial amniotic fluid and sheep fetuses in plastic bags, bio-bags. That's how they were being marketed. Alas, none of the actual bio-baggers ended up talking to me. I was stupid enough to mention an interest in the feminist history of ectogenesis the very week Trump tweeted about medical infanticide. And the biobag PR handler cut all communication between me and the lead researcher, Dr. Emily Partridge, and all the other enthusiastic researchers who were going to have coffee with me, dead. But I did get Schaffer. Have you read Water Babies by Charles Kingsley? He asked me. Have you watched James Cameron's The Abyss? He inquired. Because fetus's survival comes down to what a deep diver does: fill his lungs with water. I nodded, hoping for him to say explicitly what I, a creature of the humanities, had not quite had the gumption to contend, that fetal humans are a distinct aquatic species. Disappointingly, he stopped just short of that. For over 60 years, ultrasound visualization technology has had society seeing babies, water babies, as Thomas Schaffer insisted on calling them, in explicit reference to that children's book. And insofar as it has made it harder politically to advocate for killing them, harder to see that it is a part of the body of the gestator that one is killing when one opts out of a gestation, I am tempted to say that that visualization technology hasn't been altogether a good thing. What we don't see on the ultrasound is the mediating technology, the water, and intrauterine space is wet. The amniotic sac contains up to about a quart of oxygen-rich fluid, which ends up being mostly urine, which means that before we turn into land babies, which is to say babies, we breathe the person who is gestating us. We breathe amniotic liquor. In fact, exposure to the air stops fetal lungs from completing their development. Though we have no gills, we move our tiny diaphragms and intercostal muscles, and we do not drown. Some escapologists and, yes, deep water divers try to slow their heart rates by remembering this time before fear, this state of non-antagonism towards water, to calm themselves. But these trance-like attempts at becoming amphibian are not what Focus on the Family had in mind when it gazed via ultrasound into the abdomen of one Abby Johnson this spring on Times Square and declared the contents human. This was during a live broadcast of a fetal heartbeat amid prayers and injunctions to #SeeLifeClearly. Johnson and her supporters were adamant that the underwater entity whose face everyone assembled was seeing was not her body. Johnson was not part of a mother fetus. Johnson was Johnson, and the fetus was the human. Your body, expostulated one of the placards belonging to Johnson's team, the proponents of forced gestation. Since when does a human body have 4 hands, 4 feet, 2 hearts, and 2 separate sets of DNA? And because I'm an insufferable, disloyal daughter of Donna Haraway, of course, my response is, indeed, sir. Since when does a human body have so few? I really wanted to talk to the person waving that sign about the sheer abundance of separate sets of DNA teeming inside this wondrous world he thought of as his body. Did he know just how many symbiotic organisms? When I expressed this reaction at the time, obviously, strategic pro-abortion campaigners laughed at me. I still deny I'm missing the point, and you're in the unfortunate position of having to hear me out. As the placard almost realizes, to be a human is to be full of other bodies. In Haraway's words, it is to be a multi-species relationship. Not in a relationship, it is to be a relationship. What is happening in the ranks of the war on abortion is an inversion of this truth. The fetus becomes the bearer, perhaps the only fully coherent bearer of the status of the human, while the gestator becomes illegible as one on account of the fact that it is usually her embodiment is too noticeably, too visibly, too unavoidably multiple. It's not the assertion of fetus qua human that bothers me so much as the specific notion of the human being asserted. A bounded totalitarianism of a pure entitlement, a humanness that is in fact impossible to endow anything but a fetus with. As I say, Thomas Schaffer, the preemie liquid breathing guy I managed to pin down, he is, I suspect, a supporter of the anti-abortion political thrust, of the kind of humanization of the fetus the placard I'm quoting thinks it is doing. And though I didn't tell him this, I wouldn't disagree that the fetus is a human if the image of the human we were using were a partial, more relational, more processual one. I've always been persuaded by the Fanonian idea that one can only be anti-violent, never, alas, non-violent in the world that we're currently in. And within these structures, to do violence to other humans is sometimes part of a becoming humanism. Stay with that trouble, don't look away, says Donna. And that helps me think about the fetus within this contemporary techno-gestational mode of production, because the violence that a fetus does to an unwilling gestator is not that kind of loving violence. It is an intolerable kind. And I can think this at the same time that I think a fetus is becoming human, just as I am becoming human, or at least I hope. We are all responsible for the stew that is epigenetics, all gestating one another, and we could, I feel, learn to act like that, amplifying it, sure, but equally learning how to negotiate our boundaries, our selfishnesses, and alleviate undue and unconsensual burdens. The biobag system, ideologically speaking, is antithetical to what I'm saying here. It amuses me a bit to juxtapose headshots of its designer, Emily Partridge, and Shuley. They evoke polar ideological opposites, don't they? Anyway, here is Partridge in the middle of stressing the awe-inspiring character of the visual spectacle that she has designed, the gravid, see-through amnion that exposes the process of pregnancy to the gaze for the first time in human history. Partridge helpfully remarks that the sheep is the standard scientific surrogate for the human, and then later, the human interest angle. She evokes the odds and ends that she and her colleagues in the early days begged off the membrane oxygenation unit next door while brainstorming how to marinate a batch of tiny ungulates, used bits of piping and plumbing assembled from beer stores, apparently eBay and Home Depot. The perfected biobag system is remarkably small and simple. Uncover your target fetus via C-section at a point equivalent to that hot biopolitical threshold, a human's 23-week gestation, and then clamp and cannulate the umbilical cord so as to connect it not to the EWE anymore, but to the artificial placenta, which Partridge casually calls basically a lung. Immediately submerge the cord and fetus in your artificial amniotic liquid, where 28 days of simulated pregnancy will then pass uneventfully. Remove the lamb, put it on a ventilator, and then euthanize it for dissection. Apart from one who apparently lives on a farm somewhere in Pennsylvania that they won't tell me the address of. Partridge belongs to a newly renovated hospital complex, as anyone who has wandered down South 33rd Street in Philly will know. Yet until now, she operated without significant funding, relegated with her plastic tubs and her slimy livestock to a space that basically resembles a dingy school basement. And this is where she brooded over her darkened uterus facsimiles. This is where she camped for weeks on end. But Partridge clearly thinks it's all about to pay off big time, with an investigative device exemption in hand from the Food and Drug Administration. The biobaggers are hoping to schedule trials with human preemies next year, in 2020. After all, the Trump administration's Department of Health and Human Services has declared that life begins at conception, which is a potentially promising development for scientists who save preemies, although not for their terrified peers down the corridor who handle embryos. In an era marked by personhood bills, it is plainly in the interests of those seeking biobag funding that we see water babies, patients, swimming inside the 22-week amnion. It's undeniably compelling. You could reach your finger out and watch them react to your tickle through the polyethylene. Philly's biobags are part of a long tradition of fantasizing about the artificial womb. The mechanical uterus was imagined in the socialist debates and science fiction bestsellers of the turn of the last century, variously as a feminist plot to overthrow men by escaping women's domestic work burden, to an anti-feminist plot to render women redundant and hence disposable. 3, more diplomatically, a gender-neutral means of assistance to those unable as opposed to merely unwilling to gestate. For some of us, given the extreme harm and danger gestators risk, especially Black and working class ones, researching tech alternatives that would enable people not to gestate if they don't want to, while still making babies together, perhaps in non-dyadic ways, is all the justification one would ever need. But there are many for whom artificial womb technology is precisely the hope of a means of shoring up once and for all the power of the patriarchal private nuclear household, removing all doubt about biogenetic paternity from the equation, and indeed removing the human gestator, especially her already legally and biologically constrained ability to harm and or kill the fetus. Remove her from the scene of gestation. For them, ectogenesis is the solution to the abortion debate, which is not a debate, it's a fight. It's the solution in that once it's perfected, it would theoretically obviate the need, which is not a need, it's a desire in many cases, to kill fetuses of any age. In this lens, the glass and plastic is there not to alleviate the labor of the mother, but to save the fetus from her power of abortion. So then, depending on who's saying it, the phrase test tube baby is far from innocent. To state the obvious, it's a fantasy, a very robust one. Decades before even IVF made its debut, newspapers routinely referred to these entities as though they were real. Babies in bottles, chemical babies, ectogenetic children. There's just loads of references to these from 100 years ago. It was as though they were part of society. In fact, I think it was the New York Times referred to essentially a steamer trunk, like a suitcase, as an artificial womb, because it perhaps kept a premature neonate warm a little bit, after, and saved its life. No baby has ever been generated in or by a test tube, vial, or glass of any kind. But even as these phrases casually suggest that one can get not just beyond the blastocyst stage, but all the way to a fully grown infant, without ever leaving the petri dish, they have rolled off our collective tongue. The politics of embryology, in which the making of a human appears not as a labor, but as a magical, self-directed unfolding of life itself, has a lot to answer for here. If you've ever been a school kid, you've probably seen some kind of National Geographic video of a little seed turning into a marshmallow, which sort of folds in on itself in space. And maybe that is juxtaposed with some footage of a pretty white lady kicking around in a swimming pool, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside her. The stakes of this mystification have to do, as I argue in Full Surrogacy Now, with the imperative to occlude gestational labor qua labor, ensuring that gestators keep doing it for free. Our willingness to believe in babies in bottles is, in short, a testament to our commitment to imagining mothering labor as natural, and as nature, in fact, and gestators as environments, a correlate of which is the conviction that gestation could be carried out by an inert apparatus. Can it? Despite televised quotes like basically a lung and everything it would be getting from mom, the official line agreed upon by Partridge's team is that the question is irrelevant, okay, since improving care for preemies has nothing to do with the pursuit of automated pregnancy. Nothing. Adopting this tactic places the hitherto underfunded initiative in the optimal position for receiving support from a pro-life federal administration vehemently opposed to using fetal parts in research, but highly enthusiastic about ministering to the preborn. Undeniably, something of late-stage ovine gestation is being automated down the road from my house at the hospital. But, at least in our species, pregnancy is a multifaceted and part consciously creative undertaking. And the work of a gestator is not reducible to that of a lung. It's defined above all by a kind of agonism and a quality of nursing, and for better or for worse, the machine, at least for now, cannot nurse. As you heard, I've tended to talk about gestational labor in terms of a complex, bidirectional, violent and generous, but also necessarily ungenerous, that is to say, self-saving negotiation of care, a sometimes loving, sometimes abusive, and usually both at the same time, orchestration of crush and suck. I might need to revise this, but for now I think, for better and for worse, polyethylene sheath plus salt solution plus electronic oxygenator does not equal gestation in our species. As Maggie Nelson says, gestational labor does you. I do not, as of now, see how the fetus can be said to gestate back a machine. Well, a Ziploc bag. I don't yet know whether in vitro gestation is better or worse than the in vivo kind, but I know I can learn as a conscious act not to see water babies, when technoscience renders the walls of the womb transparent to my gaze. Today, the perfection of intensive techniques for forcing preemie survival has nothing whatsoever to do with reproductive justice. But I would love to see the queer gestational commune in which biobags of some kind, in gestators' hands, enabled us to pause, share, transfer, redistribute, and walk away from pregnancies. This would require the expropriation of the means of maximally assisted reproduction, currently monopolized by capitalism's elites. I hope we do it, and I hope we will know what it's like to manufacture our children cooperatively with the help of portable bio-handbags, or interactive brooders full of slurry, with some kind of grassroots wet tech, enabling a form of common gestational touch that inflicts no more harm on a fetus's many parents than we can collectively accept. We can insist on valorizing gestational labor, not because of its dignity. No work under capitalism is dignified, and certainly not pregnancy, but with a view to exploding, multiplying, distributing, and denaturalizing maternal parenthood, and liberating those with uteruses from the institution of the nuclear private household and the imperative to gestate. All reproduction is assisted, but it is certainly going to be up to us, since technocrats aren't going to do it for us, to pursue ways to tweak bodily biology to better privilege, protect, support, and empower those with uteruses who find themselves entangled in a gestation. Let's bring about the conditions for manufacturing one another more safely, enjoyably, and non-competitively. While we're at it, let's hold one another hospitably, exploding notions of hereditary parenthood, and multiply real solidarities. Let us build a gestational commune based on comradeship, a society sustained by kith and kind more than by kinship. Where pregnancy is concerned, let every pregnancy be for everyone. Feminism beyond womanhood, queer families against the family, real surrogacy against capitalist feminism, and real feminism against capitalist surrogacy. Full family now. That's it.
Wondering if there are any questions?
Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for your lecture. I'm over here. Yeah, mine is more of a potential expansion or questioning in some ways. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to, I guess, the sort of legal sort of frameworks that are currently underpinning not just abortion, but legal parenthood, and how you would potentially envision, or if you have done any research or thinking around the legal frameworks that underpin parenthood specifically. So ownership or like the property of the child in terms of the kind of legal frameworks that are existing now. Thanks.
Should I answer each question? Yeah, it's a great... No, in a word, I know a little bit. There are some legislatures in which children are pretty much, in a very ancient sense, still the property of the progenitors who legally registered it at birth. You know this, I'm sure. The word family basically derives from a word for a relation of chattel ownership. The famulus is the head of the patriarchal household, and all of the different, not simply blood entities, children, yes, but also wife, perhaps several wives, servants, slaves, who fit within that. Which is why Shulamith Firestone also thought that the structural oppression of children and women was very deeply sort of interlinked. The legal term for divorcing your parents is emancipate. No, I've basically done a kind of theoretical project that isn't rooted in particular legislative conditions so much as in the capitalist narratives of workplaces and bioclinical capitalists' accounts of what they are buying and selling. There's so many people doing kinship law, feminist anthropology. It was a whole area that I very much respect, but was doing something sort of different in relation to. Yeah. I was on a panel recently with someone who had just joined a support group for estranged children. There are lots of organizations doing incredible work, I think. Yeah, to talk about the pain that is kinship and not just counter-kinning, fleshing out ways to actually. There's someone in the audience I know who does chosen family kind of law and legal support. All of this. And what I would really need to sort of learn from those people in the audience. I think I'd be pro. If you're asking for kind of policy proposals, I don't really know, but intuitively I think I would be in favor of not registering babies. In general, I have this anarchistic sensibility that's like, why do we need gender on our identification documents? In fact, why do we need identification documents? In fact, why do we need, I think maybe a transitional demand would be that there could be, an unlimited number of people anonymously claiming a lifelong commitment to other people, be they infants or people of any age. I'm rambling now. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Be that as it may, have you thought much more about how to talk to children about their contingency and sort of the ways you can imagine, like, let the child name itself, or but just to think of it as a message which you can convey in the first place.
Yeah, this is my friend Madeleine Lane McKinley's intense preoccupation. How to talk about family abolition to children is an article she's written, I think. She and I talk about this with children. It seems I'm sure that my consciousness needs raising about children's liberation. I think probably all of ours does, but it's obviously for children to tell us what it is. I think I was actually telling this anecdote to somebody right before I came up here to talk about how I tried to pull off a wedding ceremony with my partner where we said, I don't want to get married to you, as part of the vows. And everyone sort of got married to each other. It was very nice. But we are the products of our historical time with all the. We have desires for weddings. I think that's part of a deep programming. I was also saying to my friend that I've had the experience of being at a wedding where I feel like I'm owed something, and if the bride hasn't put on a nice dress, I'm like, I've been shortchanged. And my drunk comrades started saying things as the night wore on along the lines of, oh, but you said that thing about how you didn't want to get married, but we knew what you really meant. We knew what you really meant. You meant forever. You know, and you could sort of tell that they needed us to have meant forever, and I get that. But we're trying to not mean that. And I think kids do fundamentally understand the need for an appearance of forever. And kids deserve, that's part of being a kid, like a really firm, permanent commitment. But I think our culture has a really profound slippage between that and a complete lack of contingency. You know, if I think a kid also needs to feel, we need to feel as kids that we're loved not just because we are continuations of our parents and reproductions of our parents, but because we're chosen to some extent. And we could also choose, as Shulamith Firestone recommended, to opt out of the household in which we are living. I know someone else who is very funny on the subject of children's liberation because she sees it as the limit case for a certain kind of nihilist, joy-driven. I mean, she was sitting with me in a cafe and we watched this German cart full of tiny toddlers just get pushed past, and all these children were sort of sitting opposite each other in a basically like a garbage cart or something. And we were wondering what it would be like if the adults pushing this thing were to disappear and the children were to direct their own transportation. And she was like, what is it that children want? That's the core question of children's liberation politics. But obviously the problem is they want annihilation, don't they? Like, they want to stick their fingers in the sockets, and they would obviously drive this cart off a cliff immediately. So that's the thing, that's the Harawavian thing of kind of being at stake to one another and being the trouble of making limits on each other's freedom when necessary, including sometimes killing each other. I realize there's a big distance between those two things, but yeah, these are just my scattered thoughts. I mean, people who've read the book know that I say towards the end of it that I think my lifelong obsession, my current obsession with queer kinning and alternative social reproduction and family abolition probably started at some point during a conversation in a car. My brother and I, these two queer progeny that my father was cursed with, and him and my mother, just a sort of nuclear car ride. And we'd seen a play, and I said, kind of very cheerfully in the back seat, like, but it doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you, Dad, found out that Ben and I were the children biologically of the milkman, you wouldn't suddenly not love us. And, you know, obviously that's, I mean, I'm sure everyone in this room would have a certain response to that because there's an ethical imperative contained in that kind of utterance from a child. But my dad's a very special individual, and instead there was a sickening silence. And I was so devastated that I couldn't speak for the rest of the ride home. And I think probably at that point some cogs started turning about how to relate to one another in a non-propertarian way.
Please.
Hi. I never do this, but I just want to say first off, thank you so much for writing your work. I actually, I remembered after I found out about your stuff and I heard your podcast on The Dig and then I found your book, I remembered that, the first thing that got me into socialism was, when I was, a little gay boy and, finding out, oh, why is it okay to be gay? Why is this okay? And one of the things that came up was, an Australian socialist manifesto that was basically a rehash of Origins of State and the Family. And that was the trajectory of my socialism, but then I got caught up with a lot of boring, straight socialists. Anyway, so, and also just reading your work helps me make sense of a kind of injustice that I feel happens to a lot of people, but sometimes we don't think of as injustice because people think of the violence that happens in the family as almost being something one just gets over, or it's adolescent to still be concerned about it. So thank you so much. And I actually I have a question, but I also wanted to respond to some of the things that people are saying, because I feel I've thought about it too, and I feel one of the things that I think is kind of a good transitional demand would also be stipends for children to be away from their families. I wonder what it would look like to actually organize around that.
Wages for childhood.
Yeah, literally. That's kind of an immediate thing to me, and I feel would explode so much, but also speak so immediately and make so much sense to so many people. But one of the things that I feel is maybe more possible now is a lot of the stuff that happens with care workers and around care workers specifically, and how I think actually my friend shared an article with me about how they're one of the most expanding sectors, I guess, of work or whatever. And I feel the work that would happen around that to organize them with labor, but also organize what it would mean to, as you've made the point so many times, expand care so that it isn't work anymore. So I don't know, I'm wondering if in the things that you've done with your research on surrogacy, you've come across people who are also care workers, doulas, and all this kind of thing, trying to make their work so diffuse that it doesn't look recognizable anymore, through what look like more kind of immediate labor demands, I guess, or I don't know, other examples of that. I mean, honestly, just riff. I love your riffing. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably anyone. I don't have a good riff. I think the examples are so granular of where we can glimpse something commune in the present. I'm sure we all have, experiences of where people. I mean, because in a way, this is sort of the point. It's a difficult point, particularly for a white person to start trying to talk about. But as I understand it, the queer black feminist, anti-capitalist, family abolitionist tradition is about saying there's no such thing as the black family. I mean, it's an oxymoron. Alexis Bourline-Gums says that, black mothers were always already queer for this reason, in a structural sense, because, as Hortense Spillers sort of told us, the edifice of the private nuclear household is a white image that was invented off the back of people who were to be kinless, constructed as kinless, and therefore not legible as gendered, or at least binary gendered subjects. And you have to have that project of reproductive stratification in this instance, in its most extreme expression as chattel slavery, to sort of make that fiction of the nuclear household unfolding like life itself. I really see a homology between the image of the family, where social reproduction happens autonomously, and this image I have of the National Geographic embryo kind of like unfolding in on itself and growing itself without any kind of labor from the outside. And people like Angela Davis was saying in the 80s, when the conversation about surrogacy started in the US, no, there have always been these surrogates making this natural white nuclear family that you're now worried about getting corrupted because of some commodification, some commodification of partial aspects of this labor that was previously mainly just free and invisibilized, or waged, but not conceived of as reproductive. Because a mammy is a different thing to a mother. It's a different gender. But the skills that, I suppose what I was saying was the skills of people who have survived when, as Audre Lorde said, they weren't supposed to. That is that's the full family now. I'm being kind of, I don't know, maybe it's a little facetious to mix up all the terms in my title and show that you can kind of, arrange them any way you want. But and some people urge me to be a bit more kind of, to stick to my guns and to say, no, we need to not use the word family, even in contexts like chosen family or whatever, because it keeps referring back to this thing. And sometimes I see the point of that, and sometimes I feel like the point is we know what we mean. So many proletarian people use that language, X or Y is family, brother, sister, it's a big language, isn't it? And that's sort of fine with me. It's not an ideology about an in-group based on blood and genetics, which is what the sort of neo-fascist kind of, the white nationalists are talking about when they talk about family. Wow, that actually didn't answer your question at all.
Yeah, but you shared so much. It sounds like part of also something that you just brought up is that like some of it would need to be really centered in stuff that works around race, which is not kind of how I thought of it before. If that makes total sense. Yeah, you heard me. yeah, but it would be I don't know, something that also has to do with the way family stratification gets racialized. Mm-hmm. But I also wonder about a lot of this is also, maybe I just have to like ask you afterwards so I can actually like write it down, but I want to know the names of some of the people you're referring to, because it's a whole tradition of thought that's like, I just was some reason never heard of, and it's just so neglected, and it's so strange that it's so neglected, so.
Yeah. No, I was saying to Mariana as well this afternoon that something seemed to happen in the 80s because of the post-utopian, the anti-utopian moment of the post-60s, where all these forms of desire for family abolitionism that used to be quite well known, people I think were acquainted, not, there was always a straight left, but there were wide swathes of the left, I think, in the 60s, who were very acquainted with the phrase abolish the family. If you just do a little dive into any kind of pamphlet archive, it's there all over the shop, abolish the family, and just obviously, because it's the locus, it's the object, it's the thing that queer and women's struggle is in opposition to. It's where all the abuse and the training in racial and worker subjectivity happens. It's where the sexual abuse happens. It's where the private parts of crucial accumulation circuits for capitalism occur. You know, it was just kind of, I think, a familiar, if not always taken seriously, slogan. And then in the 80s, it just kind of vanished, just got vanished from our collective consciousness. So now it's like, and I mean, I realize how hubristic it is to put myself up here like I'm some kind of, you know, 21st century Shuli. It's ridiculous. But there is something, I think, about the reaction she experienced when she published her manifesto of this very particular texture of like, you cannot abolish that. What are you talking about? This very, very profound glitch, you know, as though you're not even speaking English anymore, you know? That was the kind of reaction I got on Twitter at various points, you know, like you're not even making syntactical sense, you know? Like real brain explosion emoji to the max, you know? Which is depressing because that's a 50-year gap. But at the same time, there is also talk about abolishing the family everywhere. I don't know if you've noticed, but I keep seeing it. Yeah, it's perhaps having its moment. I hope. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? I guess this will be the last one.
Okay.
It's a lot of pressure. I was really grateful for your analysis of The Handmaid's Tale in the book, and when you mentioned Margaret Atwood earlier, I wanted to hear you speak a little more to, I think the word that you use in the book is that like a certain kind of white liberal feminist reads that book or sees now the Hulu show and sees it as sort of like a fantasy of sisterhood and solidarity. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more to why a certain kind of feminist finds this like, you know, fascist dystopia vision of womanhood and forced gestation as so attractive in a way.
Oh dear, here I go. So it's really interesting to me that utopia and dystopia has a very blurry boundary. I'm not a literary scholar or someone who really thinks about these things, but it's really become apparent to me that there's a sort of bad utopianism going on, a non-critical utopianism in the dystopia that is Gilead, the place they live, right, in The Handmaid's Tale. America, but a fascist slaveocracy where the line of difference is purely whether you have a womb or not. Because affectively the mechanism is so obvious to some of us. If you're disappointed as a probably white, probably definitely cis, affluent American woman that Hillary didn't win, you get to kind of take out your frustrations through this fantasy on all the annoying trans, intersectional, black feminists who couldn't shut up, could they? But if we lived in Gilead, you'd have to shut up, wouldn't you? Because we'd be in Gilead and everyone would be a feminist in this very, very reductive way. I mean, fine, you know, I really don't have a problem with people indulging kind of resentful affects like that, seriously, if they move beyond that. Because being activated by The Handmaid's Tale is really fine and important for lots of people. As I say, I would quibble that the quality of the anti-abortion activism that comes out of Handmaid's Tale cosplay is poor. It's flabby. It's, I mean, literally, their patron saint is like, no one likes abortion. And I'm like, I do. Like, come on, is this where we're at? Like, and because I'm I look at the bad things, I can't resist. This sequel, the fan service that she's just published, The Testaments. Indulge me to give you my take. So, it's all about Aunt Lydia, a woman in the upper classes of this regime, this fascist slavocracy that only oppresses people with uteruses. And Aunt Lydia has, constructed this regime. She has designed it. She's literally the architect of the women's sphere of Gilead. But decades on, it turns out that she's a sleeper cell, and she's playing this long game, and she's doing a WikiLeaks style, undermining of the regime from the inside. She leaks all this very bad stuff that Gilead has been getting up to. So not the sort of forced, the ritualized rape, or it's just the kind of inconsistencies, the fact that the justice system is inconsistent according to its own criteria. Aunt Lydia leaks a lot of kind of stuff about that. And then the regime comes down. And at the end of the book, there's a statue which bizarrely has this dedication to, and it's just the initials, AL. And that was where my brain tripped up. And I went, who do liberals think freed the slaves? And I was like, Aunt Lydia's Abraham Lincoln. And it's an anti-fascist consciousness that comes out of this fandom, because it's encouraging you to think, and I'm serious about this, that the way that social transformation happens is basically top-down. So that's what I think about The Handmaid's Tale.
Thank you guys so much, and there are probably drinks in the back still. Hope you can come back to an event soon. Bye.